The 11th century was a pivotal period in East Asian history, during which political, economic, and cultural currents overlapped and intertwined, creating a vast chessboard in which Dai Viet and the Song Dynasty held different yet closely related positions. To understand why, in 1077, two powerful armies confronted each other on the banks of the Nhu Nguyet River. We must examine the deep-seated forces of regional geopolitics, imperial ambitions, and the survival needs of a newly independent nation. East Asia at that time was not a homogeneous bloc, but a multipolar picture. The Song Dynasty, from 960 to 1279, in the center of mainland China, was a dynasty strong in economy, culture, and administration, but weak in military compared to its northern and western rivals. For more than a century, the Song had to face formidable opponents such as the Khitans, Liao, and the western Xia, Dangxiang. In exchange for peace, the Song emperor often had to cede land, pay tribute in gold, silver, and silk. This severely damaged the prestige of the Celestial Dynasty. In that context, the southern border with Dai Viet became a potential battlefield. Unlike Liao or Western Xia, opponents of equal stature, difficult to defeat, Dai Viet was seen as a moderate target, small, independent for just over a century, seemingly not strong enough to withstand a large-scale conquest. With the Song Dynasty eager to assert its authority, Dai Viet was a possible bait to make up for failures in the north and the west. Since Ngo Quien's victory at Bac Dang in 938, Vietnam has been freed from the yoke of domination for more than a millennium. By the Lai Dynasty, from 1009 to 1225, Dai Viet had formed a distinct political and social structure. King Lin Han Tong, reigned 1072 to 1127, headed a centralized court with a fairly complete bureaucracy, army, and tax system. The most prominent feature was the policy of Ingyu bin U Nong. Soldiers were also farmers and only gathered when there was a war. Thanks to that, this small country did not suffer economic exhaustion, but was still able to mobilize a large force in a short time. In addition, Buddhism was honored as the state religion, becoming the glue that bound the social spirit, creating a unique identity that was not easily subdued. Dai Viet was not just on the defensive. During the 11th century, the Lai Dynasty repeatedly attacked Champa, expanding its influence in the central region, while controlling the sea trade route along the Indochina coast. It was this rise that made Dai Viet no longer just a vagrant in the eyes of Song, but a truly independent nation. And that was completely contrary to Beijing's Celestial Dynasty vassal ideology. Three main motivations inevitably caused Song and Dai Viet to clash. First, the emperor-vassal ideology. For Song, the surrounding nations paying tribute was not only diplomatic, but also a symbol of world order. Although Dai Viet still paid tribute, in reality, it acted like an independent nation. Political autonomy, expanding its territory, and waging its own wars. This implicit equality made the Bianjing court consider Dai Viet as a rebellious nation that needed to be punished. Second, the border issue. Guangxi and Guangdong were inherently complex lands, with many ethnic minorities frequently rebelling. Dai Viet had blood relations and trade with these groups, making Song worry that the north-south connection would destabilize the border. If they conquered Dai Viet, they would not only eliminate the support of the rebel groups, but also expand their defensive shield to the south. Third, the financial crisis. After decades of paying tribute to Liao and Western Xia, the Song treasury was in a state of exhaustion. Dai Viet, with its fertile plains and important commercial position, was viewed by many officials as a reserve that could be exploited. A southern campaign promised to both avenge humiliation and replenish the national treasury with wealth and manpower. If the above motivations were only simmering, the 1075 incident turned tensions into war. Upon receiving intelligence that the Song was preparing a large army, Lai Thuong-Kit advocated preemptive strike, sending troops across the border and directly attacking the three prefectures of Ung, Kam, and Liem. Within just a few months, the Dai Viet army destroyed warehouses, killed generals, and left tens of thousands dead. This bold preemptive strike not only disrupted the Song's plan to conquer the south, but also dealt a heavy blow to the honor of the Celestial Dynasty. For the Song, the fact that a small country dared to directly attack the Central Plains was an unacceptable humiliation. The defeats against Liao and Western Xia had already shaken their prestige, and now this blow forced them to counterattack to save face. Therefore, from the end of 1076, the Bianjing court was determined to launch a major campaign, mobilizing a large force to advance to the south. For Song, this was a war of honor, interest, and strategy. But for Dai Viet, this was a life-and-death duel. The memory of 1,000 years of Chinese domination was still intact, and everyone understood that if they failed, the entire nation could lose its sovereignty. Therefore, the war with Song in 1077 was not just a battle, but a test of the nation's survival. Moreover, victory in this war would not only protect the territory, but also elevate Dai Viet to an equal political entity in the region, no longer considered a vassal in reality, even though it still maintained the form of tribute. In that tense situation, Lai Thuong-Kit chose the Nhu Nguyet River as his defensive line. This was a branch of the Cow River. The riverbed was narrow, but the water flowed fast, and the two banks were muddy, making it difficult to build a pontoon bridge. The terrain here was extremely favorable for defensive tactics. The Khao River flowing through Nhu Nguyet was narrow, fast, and winding, creating many whirlpools. To the natives familiar with hydrology, it was a natural wall to keep out foreign invaders, but to the Song cavalry, accustomed to roaming the steppe, this river was nothing more than a giant trap. When the Song army launched its southern conquest, the disparity in strength seemed to put Dai Viet in a desperate situation. However, instead of being afraid, the Lai court and its people turned the months of preparation before the battle into an unprecedented general mobilization. In that context, each step of preparation on both sides not only reflected military strength, but also exposed political mettle, strategic intelligence, and above all, the difference in the way the two civilizations faced the challenge. Emperor Tong Tan Tong and his courtiers decided to mobilize a large-scale force. The number of troops was estimated at 100,000 men, a huge number for a border campaign. They included cavalry from the north, infantry equipped with heavy armor, skilled archers, and many engineering units specializing in building pontoon bridges and clearing roads. Logistics were also carefully prepared. Food stores were stored at the border, herds of war horses were brought down from the north, and a convoy carrying supplies stretched for miles. In the commanding ranks, Quoc Qui and Trio Tiet were chosen as the commanders-in-chief of the campaign. Both were prestigious generals with extensive battle experience. Their mission was not only to defeat the Dai Viet army, but also to advance to Thang Long, forcing the Lai court to surrender. To achieve that goal, the Song army calculated that they would cross the Nhu Nguyet River, the last natural line of defense before the capital, and then attack straight into the center. In their minds, the overwhelming strength of troops and equipment would be enough to crush any defense line. However, that confidence obscured the strategic trap that Lai Thuong Kiet was secretly setting up. While the Song army was preparing to march, in Dai Viet, an atmosphere of urgency spread throughout the capital Thang Long and the villages in the border areas. King Li Nan Tong assigned full military authority to Li Thuong Kiet, the general who had demonstrated his outstanding talent in the Northern Expedition campaign. With his foresight, Li Thuong Kiet understood that confronting 100,000 Song troops directly on the plains was suicide. The only way to turn the situation around was to take advantage of the terrain and turn nature into a fortress. Along the southern bank of the river, he built a system of bamboo fences and wooden obstacles, planted as thick as a forest. Behind the fences were defensive barracks, where infantry with spears and archers were on standby. Underground stakes were driven into shallow stretches of the river in case the Song army recklessly drove their horses across. Thousands of soldiers were assigned to take turns guarding day and night, turning the defense line into a great wall of bamboo. The use of bamboo, a familiar material to the Vietnamese, was not only a practical solution, but also symbolic. The flexible but durable strength of the nation was manifested in the natural fences that turned into ramparts. This was the big difference between Dai Viet's defensive strategy and the purely materialistic military thinking of the north. However, Lai Thuong Kiet's preparations did not stop at material things. He understood that the fighting spirit of the soldiers, who were mostly peasants, would determine success or failure. Therefore, he did something unprecedented in history, using poetry as a spiritual weapon. He had the poem Nam Quoc Son Ha recited by the front line. Like a sacred prophecy affirming, this country has an owner, the southern sky determines its fate, the invaders will surely be defeated. The sound of poetry, the sound of drums mixed with the sound of waves, turned the front line into a place where sacred beliefs converged. It was not only the earliest declaration of independence in Asia, but also a psychological warfare strategy, instilling in the soldiers the belief that they were fighting under the protection of destiny. It was thanks to this belief that the spear-wielding peasants could become brave warriors when the fatherland needed them. Logistics were also carefully prepared. Food, weapons, crossbows, and arrows were gathered along the river. The villagers along the riverbank were both concerned with providing food and ready to join the fight when needed. The soldiers were trained to coordinate between archers on the shore and infantry under the ramparts, creating a multi-layered formation to intercept the enemy. Each layer of defense had a clear function. Archers on high ground suppressed from afar. Infantry under the ramparts were ready to stop anyone from crossing the river, while the underground stakes were like natural traps, capable of destroying the cavalry formation that was the pride of the Song army. At dawn, in 1077, the atmosphere on the banks of the Nhu Nguyet River was as tense as a bowstring. On the north bank, the Song army, after a long journey from Guangxi, down through the provinces of Cam, Liem, and Ung, crossed the border and advanced deep into the Lang Son, Bac-Jiang region, and finally gathered at the lower reaches of the Khao River, now directly facing the Nhu Nguyet defense line. This was the main route of advance, which had long been considered the natural gateway from the north to the Red River Delta. The Song armies, after crossing the rugged limestone mountains at the border and setting up camp at gateway areas such as Ai Chi Lang, gradually gathered down the Thuong River Valley, then followed the terrain to gather in the lower reaches of the Khao River. This concentration turned the entire Bac-Jiang, Bac Ninh region into a giant headquarters of hundreds of thousands of troops, while the south of the river was only 100 miles from Thang Long, a distance that skilled cavalry could cross in a few days if the defense line was broken. The barracks were packed tightly together, the flags were red, and the swords and spears were shining in the sunlight. The sound of drums and horns echoed like thunder to intimidate the Dai Viet army. Quoc Quy and Trio Tiet were confident that with their much larger force they would easily crush that small defense line, and from there advance southward, across the central region of Bac Bo to occupy Thang Long. On the south bank, hidden behind a dense bamboo hedge, the Dai Viet army silently observed. Archers held tight their crossbow strings, spears glistened behind wooden walls, and underwater stakes awaited the enemy's horses. This was the line blocking the natural corridor of advance from the border to Thang Long. If the Song army could not pass Nhu Nguyet, they could not advance further. The Song army opened with a rain of arrows from the north bank. Tens of thousands of arrows flew over, whistling in the wind, pouring down on the defense line like a storm. But the Dai Viet archers, hiding behind the bamboo hedge, were almost unharmed. When the Song army advanced and began to build a pontoon bridge to cross the river, Li Thuong Kiet immediately ordered to return fire. A series of arrows was fired from the south bank as dense as rain, aimed straight at the group of soldiers struggling with ropes and wooden planks. Many people were hit by the arrows and fell down. The pontoon bridge had not yet been assembled before it was destroyed. In particular, the strong current of the river had washed away all the materials connecting the pontoon bridge, showing the disadvantage when the Song army chose to cross it downstream instead of finding a detour. But because they wanted to quickly penetrate the center, they were forced to rush headlong into the place that Dai Viet had carefully prepared. The strong current swept away wood and soldiers' corpses, causing chaos in a corner of the north bank. The first river crossing failed miserably, even though the Song army started from the northeast, following the riverbed down, with the intention of approaching and breaking the defensive line. Refusing to retreat, Quoc Quy ordered the mobilization of cavalry. The Song troops, wearing shining iron armor, urged their horses to gallop down the bank and charged into the river. The water splashed white under the horses' hooves, but as soon as they reached the middle of the river, arrows rushed from the south bank. The horses were hit by arrows, reared up and collapsed, and the soldiers were swept away in the rushing water. Some managed to cross the south bank, but got caught in a field of hidden stakes. Before they could deploy their formation, the Dai Viet infantry rushed out and killed them. Blood stained the entire stretch of the river. The terrain of the river was narrow, and the strong current from upstream made any attempt to cross the river suicidal. The genius of Li Thuong Kiet was that he chose the right section of the river that did not allow the cavalry, the main force of the Song army, to exert its advantage in speed and power. Here, the powerful cavalry was like a herd of elephants lost in the swamp. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. Day after day, the Song army tried to cross the river, but each time they were stopped. They used large shields to cover themselves, but Dai Viet archers aimed at the gaps. They tried to attack at night, following small paths from the west bank of the Cao River to cross by surprise. But Dai Viet scouts discovered them, lit torches, and beat drums to warn, causing the plan to fail. Shortcuts along Tam Dao Mountain or through small streams in the Hiep Hoa, Yen Phong area were expected to help the Song army suddenly approach the defense line, but the dense forest terrain and the familiarity of the Dai Viet militia turned all those efforts into failure. Each time they failed, casualties piled up, and the morale of the Song soldiers further declined. An entire corridor of advance from Guangxi that seemed straight down was now blocked by only a river and a solid defense line. The battle lasted for weeks. In the Song camp, food supplies gradually ran out. The supplies brought from the north were not enough for the large army, while the supply route across the border from Ung Chau to Kam Chau was continuously attacked by Dai Viet soldiers and civilians. The convoys transporting food from Guangxi down the mountain road were ambushed and suffered heavy losses. Diseases spread, and thousands of soldiers were exhausted. Rumors of ghosts on the Nhu Nguyet River, the poem Nam Quoc Son Ha, echoed every night, spreading insecurity. Quoc Quy held military conferences many times, but the generals and soldiers disagreed. Some wanted to risk crossing the river again downstream. Others suggested retreating to defend the border. Confusion began to gnaw at the entire giant army. Meanwhile, Dai Viet's defense line remained steadfast, as solid as a bronze wall, tightly controlled from east to west. When he realized that the Song army was tired, had run out of food, and was sick a lot, Li Thuong Kiet decided to launch a counterattack. One dark night, he secretly sent his elite forces along the upper river, suddenly crossed to the north bank, and attacked the Song army's main camp. The sound of war drums and cheers resounded in the middle of the night, causing the Song army to panic. Fires broke out in the camp, horses neighed, and soldiers trampled each other to flee. This was a direct blow to the rear from the front line, disintegrating the enemy's command. The next morning, the Dai Viet army simultaneously launched a counterattack from the south bank, directly attacking the Song army that was still in chaos. Unable to maintain their formation, the Song army collapsed, forcing Guo Kui to order a retreat along the old route to the border. The retreat route at that time was the dangerous corridor from Bac Jiang up to Lang Son, which had been devastated after many months of transportation and ambush. Therefore, the retreat was no different from a run, with corpses strewn along the mountain road and exhausted troops dragging themselves towards Guangxi. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in battle or were captured, their bodies piled up on the riverbank. The Nhu Nguyet River, from being a defensive line, became a giant grave for the invaders. After many months, the fierce expedition from the north, from Guangxi, across the border through the plains, intending to march straight to Thang-Long, ended in a disastrous defeat. The Dai Viet army, though much smaller, relied on the dangerous terrain, brilliant strategy, and indomitable spirit to protect the country. As the firelight rose from the Song army camp and the sound of Dai Viet war drums resounded in the night, the campaign that the northern Song court had long hoped for collapsed. Guo Kui, Zhao Jie, and the remaining troops were forced to retreat in chaos. Tens of thousands of soldiers died on the banks of the Nhu Nguyet River. Thousands more died of hunger, thirst, and disease on the way back. Each army that had proudly marched south now disintegrated, becoming a shabby shadow trudging across the border. For the Song court, this was a defeat that was not easy to swallow. All the efforts of preparation, from mobilizing tens of thousands of troops, establishing food warehouses at the border, to concentrating experienced generals, were only exchanged for a humiliating result. Instead of showing off strength to save honor, the 1077 campaign further exposed the weakness of the Song army. Heavy in numbers, cumbersome in organization, but lacking in flexibility and easily worn out in a protracted war. After the defeat, the Song dynasty was forced to change its attitude. Instead of continuing its annexation plot, they agreed to sit at the negotiating table. The two sides reached a truce. The Song withdrew its troops, and Dai Viet continued to maintain diplomatic relations and nominal tribute. However, the key point was that Dai Viet's real power was preserved. The Lai dynasty continued to rule as an independent nation, not tied to the Song administrative system. For Chinese culture, this failure became a difficult stain to erase. Song history books recorded little, even avoided it, while Vietnamese history books praised it brilliantly. That silence showed the deep pain that the failed campaign left in the heart of an empire that considered itself the center of the world. Li Nantong and Lai Thong Kiet understood that peace with the Song at this time was more beneficial than prolonging the war. After the victory, the court proactively sent envoys to Bianjing, both to save face for Song and to consolidate its position as a reasonable, big country. This is a typical diplomatic lesson. The battlefield affirms strength, while the negotiation table affirms intelligence. The Battle of Nhu Nguyet in 1077 not only closed a bloody chapter between Dai Viet and Bac Song, but also opened a new chapter for the history of the Vietnamese nation. In world history, it stands alongside other great wars as proof that human will can turn the wheel of fate. In the West, the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, where 300 Spartan warriors stopped tens of thousands of Persian troops, has entered legend as a symbol of indomitable spirit. Despite the military defeat, Thermopylae contributed to fostering the Greek spirit, paving the way for later victories. Nhu Nguyet, on the other hand, is not only a spiritual symbol, but also a real victory, crushing a large-scale invasion campaign. In the east, the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Egyptian Mamluks defeated the invincible Mongol army, proved that the power of the steppe was not unstoppable. Similarly, Nhu Nguyet showed that a small country could also break the advance of the Northern Empire, protecting its independence. Therefore, Nhu Nguyet is not only a legacy of Vietnam, but also a typical example in human history of the power of will and intelligence to overcome overwhelming odds. Battles like this remind us that history is not just about numbers, but about spirit, resilience, and vision. And if you want to journey further into the great clashes that shaped nations and turned the tide of civilizations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we bring to life more forgotten wars, legendary commanders, and epic moments that still echo through the centuries.